In this emotional story, a child reflects on the strained relationship with their parents, which worsened after their father was diagnosed with cancer. Despite years of feeling unloved and unwanted, the situation reached its peak when their mother sued them after they ran away. Discover how deep-seated hatred and family conflict shaped this heartbreaking journey. My mother sued me because my father developed cancer. They despised me both as a child and after I fled. Dad wanted to reconcile with me, but Mom did not. Hey, read it. I never imagined I would be writing something like this, but I suppose I should get this off my chest. I've been carrying this weight for so long that it feels like suffocation at times. My life has been a constant struggle with my parents and frankly with myself. This is not just a vent. It's the story of how I finally decided to break free and find something better, something that feels like mine. I'll warn you that it's long and messy, but here we go. Growing up, I was never the child that my parents adored. My parents, particularly my father, made it clear from an early age that I was a disappointment. I wasn't the athletic, charming, or charismatic kid they desired. I was quiet, introverted, and more interested in books than footballs, which my father tried to shove into my hands. I'm not saying I didn't try to make them happy. God, I tried everything, but nothing was enough. My mother was equally as bad, if not worse. It was as if they were both trying to see who could make me feel smaller. Every report card, every minor error I made was scrutinized. My dad would be raped. I kept telling myself that I would never amount to anything. My mother was more subtle about it. She'd tell me she was simply disappointed, which hurt more than my father's yelling. However, comma school was my only escape. Even that was tainted by my parents' consistent disapproval. If I received an A, my father would question why it was not an A+ if I performed well on a test. My mother would tell me that it didn't matter because someone else's child was likely doing better. It was unrelenting. My childhood consisted of trying and failing to impress them. And no matter what I tried, I was never good enough. By the time I reached high school, I was a ghost in my own house. I'd lock myself in my room for hours, listening to music or playing video games to drown out their voices. I wasn't rebellious. I never had the guts to do that. I was simply invisible. They didn't care about what I was doing unless it was something they could criticize. I didn't have many friends in high school either. I was not bullied or anything like that. I just did not fit in. I was the weird kid who kept his head down, avoided eye contact, and never spoke unless asked. My parents also blamed me for that. They'd say things like, "No wonder you have no friends. You're so awkward," or "You should put yourself out there more." I wanted to scream at them and tell them that if they didn't treat me like I was worthless, I might have more confidence, but I never did. Instead, I immersed myself in my studies. School was my escape, the only place where I had control over things. The numbers made sense. The equations had answers. Essays followed a structure. It was predictable, and I craved predictability. Although I was not at the top of my class, I did well enough, and after years of feeling trapped, I finally saw a way out. College. College was my salvation. It was my opportunity to escape from my parents, to leave behind the constant disappointment and suffocation. I worked harder than I had ever done in my life to get into a good university. And when I was accepted, I didn't tell my parents. I waited until the last minute because I knew they wouldn't mind. When I finally told them, all my father said was, "I hope you don't screw it up." Thank you for your vote of confidence, Dad. When I left for college, it felt like a huge weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I moved several hours away from home and felt as if I could breathe for the first time in my life. I was living for myself, not to meet the expectations or judgments of others. College was not easy, but it was far from the misery I had left behind. At first, I struggled to adjust. I remained the same introverted, awkward guy I had always been, but no one here recognized me as the loser my parents had raised. No one realized how broken I was on the inside. I could start over, and I was determined to make the best of it. I threw myself back into my studies, just as I had in high school. But this time, things were different. I wasn't studying to flee. I was studying how to build something for myself. During my second year, I met a group of people who would transform my life. I never imagined having close friends, much less a group that felt like family. But somehow it happened. There was Jack, a guy who seemed to be the polar opposite of me, confident, outgoing, and never afraid to express himself. Then there was Maya, a quiet, artistic soul who recognized the feeling of not quite fitting in. Finally, there was Andrew, a laid-back guy with the ability to make everyone feel at ease. We met in one of our common classes and hit it off. It took me a while to truly open up to them. Jack, Maya, and Andrew were the first people to notice something in me other than failure or awkwardness. For the first time, I had people who cared about me and did not regard me as a disappointment. Slowly, I began to trust them and open up about my past, my family, in the years of feeling unworthy. Jack was stunned when he learned about my parents. He said something that stayed with me. "Man, you know nothing about them. They do not deserve you." I'd never thought about it that way before. I've always felt like I owed something to my parents, as if I had to earn their approval. But hearing someone else say that, I didn't have to. It was liberating. The years passed quickly, and before I knew it, I was graduating. My friends and I had got through it together, and I should have been overjoyed, but there was a nagging feeling in the back of my mind. I knew what was waiting for me at home. After the ceremony, my father texted me, "Do not bother coming back. You have already embarrassed us enough." I'm not even sure why I was surprised. I had always known they did not care about me. Still, it hurt. It was a reminder that no matter what I accomplished, it would never be enough for them. That night, I reached a decision. I was not going back, ever. I packed up everything I owned without telling anyone. I hopped on a bus to another city. I left the town where I grew up. The house was full of memories of their disappointment and my so-called family. I had no plans. There are no jobs lined up, no real idea what the future held. But for the first time in my life, I felt liberated, free of their criticism. They have control over the weight of their expectations. I didn't inform Jack, Maya, or Andrew that I was leaving until I had arrived in the new city. I knew they would try to talk me out of it, to tell me that I should confront my parents or try to make things better. However, there was nothing left to salvage. My relationship with my parents had broken beyond repair, and I had no intention of picking up the pieces. They didn't want me, nor did I want them. Starting over was not easy. I found a cheap apartment in a sketchy part of town and lived on my savings for a while. I applied for jobs, but nothing stuck. Every rejection felt like confirmation of everything my parents had ever told me. I wasn't good enough, and I would never make it on my own. But then I remembered what Jack said. You do not owe them anything. Slowly, I began to rebuild. I landed a job at a small technology startup. Nothing fancy, but it paid the bills. I threw myself into the work, just as I had done in my studies. It became my new escape. Every day was an opportunity to prove to myself that I could succeed on my own, without my parents, without their approval. It was tough. There were days when I wanted to give up. But I kept moving forward. The hardest part was being alone. I had left my friends behind, and while I did keep in touch with them, it wasn't the same. They didn't understand why I had to leave and why I couldn't confront my parents. But I knew they couldn't fully comprehend what it was like to grow up in a household where you were constantly reminded of your worthlessness. It took months, but I finally found my footing. I began making new friends at work. People who knew nothing about my background. It was refreshing, being around people who saw me for who I was now rather than who I had been in the past. I began to feel like I belonged somewhere. Perhaps I wasn't as broken as I thought. But just as I thought I'd escaped my past life, it threw me another curveball. I received an unexpected phone call from my mother. I hadn't heard from her or my father since the day I graduated, and I had no intention of contacting them. But there she was. Her voice was shaking as she told me that my father had been in an accident. He was in the hospital, and she wasn't sure if he would make it. For a moment, I felt nothing. The man who had spent my entire life tearing me down lay in a hospital bed, and I didn't care. But then guilt set in. He was still my dad, no matter how much I disliked him. And a part of me wondered whether I should go back. Should I forgive him? Should I be present for him in his final moments? I wasn't sure what to do. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, replaying every horrible thing he had ever said to me. Nonetheless, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was my chance to make things right, or, at the very least, get some closure. But then the shock arrived. The next morning, I received another call, not from my mother, but from an attorney. Apparently, my father had died during the night. He had left a will, which included my name. I did not want anything from him. I didn't want his money, belongings, or anything that reminded me of the life I'd left behind. But curiosity got the best of me, and I agreed to meet with the attorney. That meeting was one of the most surreal moments of my life. The lawyer gave me a letter written by my father before his death. In it, he admitted that he had never believed in me and had always assumed I was doomed to fail. But as he lay on his deathbed, he realized how mistaken he had been. He told me he was proud of me, regretted how he had treated me, and hoped I could forgive him. I wasn't sure what to think. This man, who had spent his entire life making me feel worthless, was now asking for forgiveness. It seemed like too little, too late. At the same time, it provided me with a sense of closure that I had not realized I needed. I left the attorney's office with a heavy heart, unsure what to do next. I didn't feel like I'd fully escaped my past, but for the first time I felt like I could move forward. My father's death marked the end of a chapter in my life that I had been trying to avoid for so long. While I still had a lot of healing to do, I knew I was finally on the right track. Hey, read it. I'm back with part 2 of my crazy journey. If you read my previous post, you know I had a difficult upbringing, and after graduating from college, I cut ties with my parents and relocated to a new city. Starting over was difficult, but I eventually landed a job at a tech startup. I thought everything was going well for me until life threw me another curveball. Let S dive right in. Following the whirlwind of leaving my old life and settling into a new city, I was able to secure a position at NextGen, a mid-sized technology company. They were doing some innovative things with data analytics and cloud solutions, and while I wasn't particularly interested in technology, I figured it was a reliable place to start. I started as a junior marketing associate, which was a fairly low-level position that at least paid the bills for the first few months. Everything was going fine. I was learning the ropes, getting to know the ins and outs of the business while keeping my head down. I wasn't the most outgoing guy, but I made some friends at work, including Chris from accounting and Lily from human resources. We'd get coffee on lunch breaks and bond over our shared dissatisfaction with the monotony of office life. Then one day, everything changed. I remember it vividly. It was Tuesday morning, and I was sitting at my desk, working on a social media campaign for one of our small clients. When I was called into my manager's office, I didn't think much of it at first. I assumed it was a routine check-in, but when I walked in, the atmosphere was off. My manager, Greg, was sitting behind his desk with a stern expression, and next to him was the HR manager, Lily, the same one I'd been grabbing coffee with. "Have a seat," Greg said, his tone cold and formal. I sat down, feeling a pit forming in my stomach. Something was wrong. "Look, I'm going to cut to the chase," Greg began. "We've been reviewing your performance, and it's just not meeting the company's expectations. We're going to have to let you go." I was stunned. Sure, I wasn't the best marketer in the world, but I hadn't been slacking off either. I thought I was doing fine, decent even, but here they were, telling me I was out. "What do you mean? Can you be more specific?" I stammered, trying to keep my composure. Greg sighed, glancing at Lily, who just gave me a sympathetic look. "Your campaigns haven't been driving the results we were hoping for. We need people who can hit the ground running, and unfortunately, we don't think you're a fit for that." I sat there speechless. I'd been fired before I even had a chance to really prove myself. It felt like a punch to the gut. Lily handed me an envelope. "This is your severance package," she said softly. "You'll be paid for the next 2 weeks, and we're offering career counseling services if you need them." I couldn't even process what was happening. It was like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I grabbed the envelope, muttered a thanks, and walked out of the office in a daze. I packed up my things in silence, feeling the weight of disappointment and failure settling on my shoulders. Chris came over looking shocked. "Dude, what the hell happened?" he whispered. "I got fired," I said flatly. He looked at me like I just told him I'd been hit by a car. "That's bullshit, man. You didn't deserve this." Maybe I didn't quote T. But it didn't matter. I was out. I gave Chris a half-hearted smile, grabbed my stuff, and left the office without looking back. For the next few weeks, I spiraled into a pretty dark place. I thought leaving my parents behind would be the hardest thing I'd ever do. But this felt like a whole new level of failure. I had no job, no direction, and the little savings I had were quickly dwindling. I spent my days sending out resumes and cover letters, but the job market was brutal. It seemed like no one was hiring, and the few interviews I did get went nowhere. I felt like I was back to square one, stuck in the same cycle of not being good enough. But then, out of nowhere, something unexpected happened. One evening. As I was mindlessly scrolling through job postings, my phone buzzed. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it, but something made me open it. "Hey, this is Daniel Lawrence. I heard you're looking for work. Let's meet Daniel Lawrence." The name sounded vaguely familiar, but I couldn't place it. I quickly Googled him and nearly dropped my phone when I saw who he was. The CEO of Nexus Solutions, one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the country. I had no idea how he'd gotten my number, but I wasn't about to question it. This was the opportunity I'd been waiting for. I replied, agreeing to meet the next day at a coffee shop downtown. When I walked in, I spotted him immediately. A tall, charismatic-looking man in his late 40s, with sharp features and a commanding presence. He waved me over to his table. "Thanks for meeting with me," I said nervously, sitting down across from him. "Of course," he replied with a smile. "I've heard some good things about you." I had no idea who would have said anything positive about me, but I was not going to argue. We chatted for a while, and I told him about my time at NextGen and how I was let go. To my surprise, he appeared genuinely interested. "You have potential," he said, after I had finished my story. "I can tell, and I believe you haven't had the right opportunities yet." He was correct, but it was still difficult to believe someone like him saw something in me. Then came the offer. "I am not looking to hire anyone right now, but I could use some help with a side project. He said. "It isn't glamorous, but it could lead to something bigger if you're interested." I did not hesitate. I agreed to assist him, despite having no idea what I was getting into. Over the next few months, I worked closely with Daniel on a variety of small projects, the majority of which were marketing-related for Nexus Solutions. It wasn't particularly groundbreaking, but it kept me occupied and gave me a reason to get out of bed in the morning. Daniel and I became closer during that time. He was not the intimidating CEO I had expected. He was down-to-earth and funny. Most importantly, he believed in me. He encouraged me to think outside the box, take risks, and stop doubting myself. Daniel became ill about 6 months after starting to work with him. It began as a minor cold, but quickly developed into something far worse. He was diagnosed with a serious autoimmune disorder, and his health quickly deteriorated. I wasn't sure what to do. Here was the one person who had given me a chance when no one else did, and now he was bedridden and fighting for his life. One night, he called me. "Hey, I need you to do something for me," he explained. His voice was weak but determined. "I trust you." My heart pounded. "Anything, man. What do you need?" "I am going to be out of commission for a while," he said. "I need you to keep everything running at Nexus. I've already spoken with the board. They will support you. But I need you to lead the charge." I was floored. Run a multi-million-dollar technology company. I could barely manage my personal life, let alone a business. But Daniel would not accept any excuses. "You're capable of more than you realize," he said. "I've seen what you can accomplish. Here's your chance to prove it." The next few months were hectic. I was thrust into a leadership position at Nexus, with no idea what I was doing. But somehow I managed to keep things afloat. I worked around the clock to manage marketing campaigns, investor meetings, and internal company politics. There were times when I thought I was going to fail, but whenever I felt like giving up, I heard Daniel's voice in my head telling me I could do it. Then came the breakthrough. Nexus had struggled to gain market share, and our competitors were closing in. I knew we needed something bold, something that would distinguish us. I spent weeks brainstorming ideas, running scenarios, and crunching numbers until I devised a marketing strategy that I believe has the potential to turn things around. It was risky. It entailed lowering our flagship products' prices by 20% for a limited time in order to increase demand, with the goal of gaining a larger customer base and generating long-term revenue. The board was skeptical, but I fought hard for it. Convinced that it was the right decision, we launched the campaign, and within weeks, the company's revenue increased by 8%. I could not believe it. My risky gamble had paid off, and Nexus was back in the game. Daniel called from his hospital bed to congratulate me. He sounded weak, but he spoke with pride. "You did it," he said. "I knew you could." The success of the campaign did more than just save the company. It cemented my position at Nexus. Daniel eventually returned to work, and he made me an offer that would change my life forever. "You have proven yourself," he said. "I want you to continue as the chief marketing officer, but there is more. I am offering you a percentage of the company's revenue as a bonus. We are now partners." I was speechless. A partnership? A share of the revenue? This exceeded my wildest expectations. I agreed without hesitation. Nexus Solutions thrived for the next 3 years under my marketing leadership. We launched several additional campaigns, which increased our revenue by 1%. The company entered new markets, acquired smaller competitors, and established itself as the industry's dominant force. Daniel, who had recovered but decided to step back from day-to-day operations, placed complete trust in me for the company's future. There were some shocking moments along the way, such as when one of our biggest competitors attempted to poach me with a ridiculous offer of stock options and a lucrative position, but I declined. Nexus was now my home. I had built something here, and I wasn't going to abandon it. Another surprise came when Daniel revealed that he had included me in his will. I was more than just his business partner. I was also his friend. He promised that if anything happened to him, I would inherit his shares in the company. It was an overwhelming gesture that rendered me speechless. I never imagined I'd be in a position where someone would trust me with something so important. But perhaps the most shocking moment of all was when my parents, who had all but abandoned me years ago, reappeared in my life. I received an unexpected phone call from my mother, who expressed her pride in everything I had accomplished. It felt surreal, like I was speaking with a stranger. They wanted to reconnect and make amends for years of neglect and mistreatment. But I was not the same person as before. I wasn't the terrified, insecure child who needed their approval. I had created something for myself that they had never thought I was capable of, so I politely declined their offer. It was not out of spite or rage. I'd just moved on. Daniel and the Nexus team had become like family to me, and that was sufficient for me. Now, 3 years after taking on the role of Commander-in-Chief at Nexus, I can hardly believe what has happened. It's been a wild ride, from being fired to running a multi-million-dollar business. There have been many ups and downs, but I've learned one thing. You cannot let your past define you. I'm not sure what the future holds for Nexus or me, but I do know this. I am no longer the same person I was when I first moved to this city. I'm stronger, more confident, and for the first time in my life, I believe I'm exactly where I should be. Hello, Reddit. It's been a while since I last posted, and a lot has happened since then. If you've been following my story, you'll know that after being fired, I worked my way up to become a partner and eventually Commander-in-Chief of Nexus Solutions, a multi-million-dollar tech company. But just when I thought I'd finally escaped my previous life, it decided to draw me back in. And it all began when my mother showed up at my door. This section of my story is much darker than what has come before. Honestly, I'm still processing everything, but writing has always helped. So here we go. It was a quiet Saturday morning. I had just gotten into my routine. Coffee, a little work, perhaps a jog later when there was a knock on my door. At first, I assumed it was a delivery. However, when I opened it, there she was, my mother. The woman I hadn't seen in years stood on my doorstep, wearing the same cold expression I remembered from childhood. "Mom," I said, my voice barely audible. I didn't expect to see her again, let alone in my own home. She looked older and tireder than I remembered. Her once well-kept appearance had been replaced by deep lines of bitterness etched into her face. Her eyes were bloodshot, and even from where I stood, I could smell alcohol on her breath. "It was only 10 a.m. I need to talk to you," she said, pushing past me and entering my home without waiting for an invitation. I stood frozen for a moment, completely caught off guard. My thoughts raced. Why was she here? What did she want? The last time we spoke was when my father died. Even so, the conversation was brief and emotionless. Now she was in my life, acting as if nothing had happened. I closed the door and followed her into the living room, where she had already sat down on the couch. Her purse was clutched tight in her lap, like a lifeline. I felt the tension in the air. "Look, Mom, if this is about Dad," I began, but she interrupted before I could finish. "Of course, this is about your father," she blurted out, her voice slurred from whatever she had been drinking that morning. "Do you think I came here for a friendly chat? You have some nerve thinking you can just walk away from your family and live this luxurious life, while I was left with nothing." I blinked, taken aback by the venom in her words. "What exactly are you talking about? I did not walk away from anything. You and Dad never wanted me. I'm just trying to make a life for myself." She scoffed, and her lips curled into a sneer. "You're attempting to establish a life by stealing everything that should have been ours." I didn't know what she was talking about. I had not stolen anything. Every bit of success I've had stemmed from hard work and perseverance. But before I could reply, and she went on a tirade. "Do you think you can just run off and take everything for yourself? You are responsible for your father's death." Her voice rose and became shrill. "If you hadn't left and abandoned us, he might still be alive. But no, you had to flee and pretend to be a successful businessman. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. She blamed me for his death. The man who had spent my entire life insulting and tearing me down. The man who had never shown me any affection or support. That was absurd. But in that moment, all of my old feelings of guilt and inadequacy flooded back. I felt like a child again, being chastised for failing to meet their unrealistic expectations. I did not abandon anyone. I spoke, my voice shaky but firm. I left because I needed to. You and your father showed no concern for me. You are already aware of this." She disregarded my words. Her eyes narrowed as she leaned forwards. "You have a nice life here, don't you? Large house, fancy job. Probably more money than you can handle." "Okay, I want my share. Your father shaped you into the man you are, and I deserve something for all the years we spent raising you." I stared at her, astounded by her audacity. "You want to share?" I repeated. I'm not sure if I heard her correctly. "That's correct," she stated, her voice hardening. "I'm familiar with the company. I know how much you make. I have nothing, and it is your fault. So you're going to pay me what I am owed?" This was beyond what I could have expected. She'd always been cruel, but this demanded a piece of the company that I had worked so hard to establish. That was absurd. "Mom, I owe you nothing," I said with a firmer voice. "You and Dad ruined my life. I built it on my own. You did not help me. You attempted to hold me back." Her expression twisted into an ugly scowl. "You selfish little bastard," she hissed. "You think you can simply brush me off like that? Well, I have some news for you. I am going to take you to court. I will sue you for what is rightfully mine." At that moment, a shiver ran down my spine. My own mother threatened to sue me. I had no idea what legal grounds she believed she had. However, just the threat caused me to feel anxious. "Good luck with that," I said, attempting to keep my voice steady. "You will not win. We'll see about it." She spat, stood up, and glared at me. "I've already spoken with a lawyer. I'm going to make you pay for abandoning us. With that, she stormed out of my home, slamming the door behind her. The following few weeks were a blur of stress and uncertainty. True to her word, my mother sued me, claiming a portion of my earnings and a stake in Nexus Solutions. Her claim was absurd. There was no legal basis for this. But the fact that she had actually gone through with it bothered me. I had never been sued before, much less by my own mother. Her lawyer, Anthony Wilkins, was a low-level attorney. I looked into him after the lawsuit was filed, and discovered that he had a reputation for taking on desperate clients who couldn't afford proper legal representation. My mother's alcoholism made her a prime target for someone like him. He likely saw her as a quick payday, but the prospect of going to court against her weighed heavily on me. Daniel, my business partner and friend, remained surprisingly calm when I explained what was going on. "She has no case," he said. "She's just trying to get you down. Do not let her get to you." But this was easier said than done. As the weeks passed, the stress of the impending lawsuit grew on me. My mother always knew how to get under my skin, and this was no exception. Every day, I felt like I was fighting to keep my life together. Then one day, something unusual occurred. I received a call from Kevin O'Donnell. He was a private investigator I hired to look into my mother's lawyer and ensure there were no surprises in court. What Kevin discovered changed everything. Kevin told me over the phone that Anthony Wilkins is not only cheap, but also dirty. He's been involved in a few shady deals over the years, taking bribes and fabricating evidence. The guy has a price. I felt a glimmer of hope. "Do you think he could be bought?" I inquired, the wheels in my head already turning. "Absolutely." Kevin stated that if you make the right offer, he will fold like a cheap suit. I knew it was dangerous, but I was desperate. My mother had dragged me into this nightmare, and I would not let her win. So I told Kevin to set up a meeting with Wilkins. The meeting took place in a dingy bar on the outskirts of town. I felt like I was walking into a bad crime drama, but this was my new reality. When I arrived, Wilkins was already sitting in a booth in the back, nursing a glass of whiskey. He appeared even more disheveled in person than I had anticipated. His suit was wrinkled, his tie was untied, and his eyes were bloodshot, from what I assumed was a combination of alcohol and insomnia. I entered the booth across from him and exchanged a tense greeting. "You know why I'm here?" I said, getting right to the point. He offered me a crooked smile. "I do," he said, taking a sip from his drink. "Your mother is very angry. She thinks she's entitled to everything you have." "Well, she's wrong. I said something, and I believe you are aware of it." Wilkins shrugged and leaned back in his seat. "Maybe, but that isn't my problem, is it? My job is to represent her. I understand what your job is," I said with a low voice, "but I also understand you have a price." He raised an eyebrow, obviously intrigued. "Go on," I laid it out for him. "You drop the case, walk away, and receive $50,000 cash." No questions were asked. Wilkins paused for a moment, his gaze narrowing as he considered the offer. $50,000, that's correct," I said. My heart is pounding in my chest. "It is more than you will ever receive from my mother." He chuckled softly and shook his head. "You've got plenty of balls, kid. But let me tell you what. I will take it. You will have the case dismissed by the end of the week." I didn't trust my ability to speak. I simply nodded and stood up, sliding an envelope containing half the money across the table. "When the case is dropped, you will receive the remaining funds." Wilkins grinned and pocketed the envelope. "It is a pleasure to do business with you." I walked out of that bar feeling relieved. It wasn't the most ethical decision I'd ever made, but I wasn't going to let my mother destroy everything I had built. The case was dismissed exactly 1 week later, as promised. My mother's lawyer withdrew, citing irreconcilable differences with his client. My mother was obviously furious. She called me, yelling and cursing, demanding to know what I'd done. However, I did not provide her with a satisfactory response. I blocked her phone number and resumed my normal activities. Even though I had won the legal battle, the emotional toll remained. My own mother had attempted to destroy me. She had blamed me for my father's death, attempted to extort me, and dragged me through a legal nightmare. The entire experience left me feeling drained, bitter, and disillusioned. I had hoped to leave my past behind, but it seemed determined to follow me no matter how far I ran. In the months that followed, I dedicated myself to my work at Nexus. The company was thriving, and under my leadership, we launched several new projects that increased our revenue significantly. We expanded into international markets, acquired a few smaller startups, and established ourselves as a dominant player in the technology industry. On the outside, everything seemed perfect, but on the inside, I was still dealing with the consequences of my mother's betrayal. Daniel noticed a change in me. We had always been close, but following the lawsuit, I became more withdrawn and guarded. He attempted to talk to me about it, but I was not prepared to open up. The truth was that I didn't know how to process what had happened. How do you move on when the person who is supposed to love you unconditionally turns against you like that? Eventually, I sought therapy. It was not easy. I had always been the type to keep things inside, to push through pain without acknowledging it. But my therapist helped me realize that I'd been carrying the weight of my parents' rejection for far too long. The lawsuit was simply the culmination of years of unresolved trauma from therapy. I started to heal. I learned to let go of my guilt, anger, and desire for validation from people who never truly cared about me. It was a slow process, but I began to feel lighter and freer. I haven't heard from my mother since the lawsuit. I assume she's still drinking herself to death, but I'm no longer responsible for her decisions. I quote, "V accepted that I cannot change the past or the people in it. All I can do is move forward." So, here I am. Reddit. 3 years after my mother's lawsuit, I'm still standing stronger than ever. Even Nexus Solutions is thriving, and I've built a life for myself that I'm proud of, one that I created on my own. Life is filled with unexpected twists and turns. But one thing I've learned is that you can't let your past control you. People will attempt to drag you down, even those who were meant to lift you up. However, at the end of the day, you can only rely on yourself. It feels great to have this off my chest.